after the
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Frazier, and I'm the archivist for our history collections at Lapis Library. Thank you for attending our Fall 2025 presentation of the Medical History Interest Group Lecture Series. These presentations are sponsored as part of the Ruth and John Moskop Lecture Series in the Lapis Library History Collections. While this is our last event for the Fall 2025 semester, Joyner Library is hosting Dr. Jennifer McKinnon to present Archaeology and History of an Underwater World War II Pacific Battlefield tomorrow at 3:30 in the Faulkner Gallery on the second floor of Joyner Library. This event is in conjunction with their exhibit, In Their Footsteps, Exploring World War II Through Archival Records. If you have not already done so, please sign the attendance sheet and help yourself to refreshments. After the presentation, please feel free to view our exhibits on the second and fourth floors. I will now turn it over to Jennifer Daugherty to introduce David Durant.
Hello, I'm going to introduce David, one of our speakers. David Durant is a professor and federal documents and social sciences librarian at Academic Library Services at ECU. He holds a Master of Science and Library and Information Services from the University of Michigan and an MA in Russian and Soviet History from the University of California, Los Angeles. His interests include the use of disinformation and propaganda, reading in the digital age, and 20th century history. He also manages the Cold War and Internal Security Collection located in Joyner Library. There is a library resource guide to the collection, and related blog posts can be found on the library's website. And then Tom Savitt is going to introduce our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to introduce Sheena Eagan, my colleague. I guess does it say, no it doesn't, MPH PhD, Associate Professor in the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies at the Brody School of Medicine. She also directs the Medical Humanities and Ethics Distinction Track and actually spearheaded its establishment here at Brody. Her research explores the intersections of bioethics, medical humanities, and the history of medicine, with particular attention to ethical challenges in times of war, disaster, and public health crisis. She has published and presented widely on military medical ethics, social determinants of health, and the historical legacies of medicine under conditions of social and political upheaval. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sheena Eagan.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So unlike some of the other lectures, you get two presenters for the price of one today. We will be handing off back and forth throughout the presentation. I'm going to be starting it off and then wrapping it up. So I'm going to start by just explaining one of the things that brought me to study this. I have long studied Holocaust medicine. I have a weird title of being a champion for medicine after the Holocaust, which is a title from this institution based in Houston that is about teaching medical students and healthcare providers about the history of medicine during the Holocaust. So I've studied that for now over a decade, which is crazy to say out loud. And as I presented those lectures, I was always honestly surprised by how few people knew about the complicity of physicians in the atrocities that happened during the Holocaust. Throughout my studies of that era, I often came across discussions of Unit 731. Unit 731 is an even lesser known example of medical atrocities during World War II. And it is unknown for some very specific and ethically problematic reasons that we will get into at the end. But what we wanted to do today, and this is very much a works in progress of an ongoing project that me and David are working on, but we wanted to understand exactly how the medical atrocities of Unit 731 could have taken place. What was the context that made this possible? Because these people didn't just wake up one day and decide to be insane and commit medical atrocities. This was a slow roll. And so that is what we're going to present to you today, and we're also going to have some discussion at the end about the implications and why this should even matter. So before we get started, I do want to just issue a little content warning. This presentation contains descriptions of medical atrocities, human experimentation, and wartime violence. Like good historians with access to testimonials, we do have a lot of quotes directly from people who were present during these acts, and those quotes in particular can be quite disturbing. So we want to advise you about that and encourage you to take care of your own well-being. We will not be offended if you need to step out briefly and collect yourself, but we are sharing these horrors for a good reason. We cannot forget that these things happened, and we have to discuss them to stop them from happening again. So this is an overview of what we're going to talk about. First, we'll have an introduction. Then, setting the scene, I will briefly walk through a history of modern Japanese medicine, looking also at the state of the art for medical ethics during that time, because for those of you who are medical students, medical ethics in the Eastern world have a different heritage and different philosophical basis than Western bioethics. We'll also look at military medicine and how it developed leading up to World War II. Then we'll dig into exactly what happened with Unit 731 and the leader of that unit, Shiro Ishii. We will then explore how this was not a unique evil to Shiro Ishii in Unit 731, but there were in fact broader medical atrocities happening across Japan and occupied territories during that time. So then David will walk through some of the atrocities beyond Unit 731. Then we'll get into the post-war consequences and what happened at the end of the war, and then end with some discussion and conclusion. So this is our abstract, just to ground us in what we are actually talking about today. I'm not going to read it aloud, but I will pause, because I know you are all able to read. So we are really interested, as I said, in exploring the history of these crimes, but more specifically their context and the broader conditions that made them possible. So let's move to the history of modern medicine in Japan. Now, this is a very brief overview, and I am not an expert in traditional Chinese medicine, so I can't speak much to how things were before. But in 1868, and I will also just say a couple of things. One, sometimes Shiro Ishii is referred to as Ishii Shiro instead of Shiro Ishii. These are conventions around first name, last name, or family name first. We're going to try to stay consistent with the Western first name followed by family name, which is Shiro Ishii, but some documents do refer to it otherwise. And I do also want to start by apologizing for my pronunciation of terms that I will inevitably butcher since I've only read them in books. So the first one is the Meiji Restoration. That's why I wanted to give that little disclaimer in case I said that wrong. This represented a really pivotal moment in Japan when they abandoned the previous system of governance, which was very similar to what we would call a feudal system here in the West. They embraced, as part of that embrace, they also moved away from traditional Chinese medicine and started to more broadly embrace Western things, including Western science and medicine. They were very early adopters of the germ theory. And for those of you who are students of the history of medicine, this era in the late 1900s is a very pivotal moment in the history of medicine. This is when we see the bacteriological revolution come that really changed thinking about what causes disease. This is when we see the introduction of germ theory. So we now know that germs cause disease instead of previous theories which were grounded in things like miasmas or humors. So the germ theory comes on the scene in the late 1800s, and it was adopted in various levels across the world. The Japanese adopted it early, and they also adopted and imported other aspects of European medicine, medical science, and practice. I, of course, as I mentioned early, kind of coming at this from a Holocaust medicine perspective, I was interested in especially those German influences. And I came across the fact that they were eager to include the German idea of a Staat medicine, which is medicine as a function of state power. Around this time, there was a lot of recognition that medical work should fall under the obligations of the government. So medicine was becoming much more not militarized, but more public across the world. During this time, the Japanese founded medical schools, and they also started to establish public health and hygiene bureaus. Within the Japanese world, the emphasis was very clearly on hygiene, epidemic prevention, and population health. And this was something that they carried forward rapidly and with great success, especially in military medicine, which is something that David will be talking about in a moment. So they had really, they had some of the earliest global success stories when it came to national campaigns around epidemic control and prevention. And we're telling you this on purpose because this context will shape the establishment of Unit 731. But kind of stepping aside from germ theory, this is a really interesting moment in the history of medicine for other reasons that impact our research project today. This was an interesting moment where eugenic science, which can really be understood as medicalized racism, was pretty prominent across the globe. This is the idea that there are both superior and inferior races, and beyond that, that humans should be attempting to kind of weed out the inferior races or inferior people using the kind of technology that we use in animal husbandry, where we breed out undesirable characteristics. So this was informed by the fact that in the early 1900s, we were seeing social Darwinism take grip on the world. Social Darwinism is this idea that you can breed out these negative traits because natural selection will allow parents to pass on traits to their children. This was, I know that this sounds boring and obvious to you, but this was very novel at the time. That combined with the Industrial Revolution really did teach people that with science, we can overcome anything. We can overcome so many of the social ills that are plagues on our current society. It's really important, as I've mentioned a couple of times, that eugenic thinking was not just in Japan and in Germany, it was pervasive globally. There were international eugenics conferences that, in fact, the United States and the UK really led the way in. So eugenic thinking was pervasive, even here in North Carolina. But since I didn't know, I was very intrigued to find out that the same thing was happening in Japan. They were embracing this eugenic thinking and even founded the Japanese Society of Racial Hygiene in 1930. And this very much crystallizes that link of heredity, hygiene, and nationalism, and already starts to show how the language of science and medicine is being really broadly applied to policy. Now, all of a sudden, ideas around inferior and superior races are talked about alongside epidemic control and hygiene, kind of desensitizing or normalizing certain things that shouldn't be. In 1940, there was a national eugenics law that promoted improvement of the race and also included sterilization of the unfit. This was something, although they did not engage in mass sterilization campaigns in the same way that the Germans and Americans did, they still had sterilization laws and eugenic laws at this time, highlighting the cultural moment. Also of interest to me, thinking, once we get to the atrocities, how could physicians be involved in these things? It's important to think about how physicians are considered. They were considered at this time to not be really the healers of individuals. And I'm going to avoid tangents about the difference between Eastern and Western bioethics, because bioethics in the West is very much grounded in the individual and in autonomy, and in the Eastern side, it's much more communitarian. But at this point, it's important to recognize that physicians were seen as guardians of the broader national health of Japan or of the population's body, and not of the individuals. There was no patient-centered ethical code like the Hippocratic Oath that you might think of here in the West. that was not a requirement. And in fact, there was no formal ethics education in medicine in Japan. Instead, there was this expectation that because of their level of education and social status, that they will act virtuously, and it does not need to be taught to them. It can be assumed. A great point of advocacy for maintaining ethics education in medical education, just as a fun side note. Also interesting is that there was at this time a proliferation of secret military societies that were starting to come up. And I think that this is an interesting point of discussion because much of what is normalized in a profession and in a group can really be understood through those professional societies. There were not many professional medical societies at this time. There was in fact only one, but there was this proliferation of the secret military societies that many people were a part of. And on that note, we will transition to military medicine with David.
Just to fill in, finish filling in the context before we get to that Sheena was discussing before we get to the core of our presentation, I'm going to talk about two specific phenomena that'll help fill in the rest of that picture. One is a specific type of Japanese medicine, and the other is a place where that form of medicine was applied. The type of medicine, as you can see, is Japanese military medicine, which, as Japanese medicine in a whole, medicine related to the Japanese Army, and then eventually the Navy as well, had its origins in the 1870s. The Army Medical School was established after they used civilian medical schools to train doctors. They established the Army Medical School for good in 1888. They renamed it the Sanitary School in 1894, which I think is very indicative because it shows that the Army in particular, the Army Medical Corps as it was emerging, also emphasized the same factors of hygiene, disease prevention, epidemic prevention, sanitation, that was being emphasized in terms of civilian medicine and civilian public health in Japan. And of course, if you're familiar at all with military history, you know that traditionally through the 19th century, disease was the great killer of soldiers. For every soldier lost in combat, several soldiers would die because of diseases, because you had all these men put together in a very cramped camps. They were close together for long periods of time, and sanitation, again, the germ theory of disease was just in the process of being discovered at this time. So it wasn't until the late 19th century that people truly began to understand how diseases emerged among populations and ways that you could curtail the spread of diseases among large groups of people. So the emphasis, again, trying to prevent disease among the troops. The first time Japan went to war in 1894-95 against China, this didn't quite work the way they were hoping. They lost about 1,100 troops in combat, but they lost about over 10 times that number, about 15,000 roughly, to disease. However, by the time 10 years later they went to war against the Russians, which is essentially Imperial Japan's coming out party, 1904-1905, the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese attempts at military medicine and military health, military hygiene, sanitation, disease prevention came to fruition. Because when they went to war against the Russians, they suffered about 60,000 battle fatalities, but only 21,000 disease fatalities. Now that's actually more in an absolute sense in terms of losses to disease than they suffered in the Sino-Japanese War a decade earlier, but the size of the Japanese army was 4 times larger when they fought the Russians as when they fought the Chinese a decade before. So again, relative terms, they did far better. In fact, to the point, I'll just use this as a brief sort of item. An American military doctor who was with the Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War wrote a book called The Real Triumph of Japan, Louis L. Seaman, extolling the virtues of the Japanese medical corps and especially its ability to prevent disease among the troops. And so here's a quote from a couple Australian scholars. At the turn of the century, Imperial Japanese Army, influenced by the discoveries of Pasteur and Koch, Japanese military medicine's emphasis on sanitation and disease prevention had no counterpart among Western armies. So the Japanese army was really at the cutting edge in terms of disease prevention, epidemic prevention, sanitation, things like that. And then I'm moving on to the place where Japanese military medicine unfolded, and the place where a lot of this story we're telling is going to unfold. It's Manchuria. Manchuria is right here, this map. This is the northeast corner of China. It borders on the Korean peninsula, and it's right across the Sea of Japan from the Japanese home islands. And when the Japanese went to war against China, they did the bulk of the land fighting was in Manchuria. And then when the Japanese went to war against the Russians 10 years later, again, the bulk of the land combat occurred in Manchuria. As a result of their victory over the Russians in 1905, the Japanese gained a permanent sphere of influence in Manchuria, including control of what was called the South Manchurian Railway, other economic interests, and the ability to station a force of troops in southern Manchuria. And a couple years after the war, and I believe around 1910, the Japanese actually annexed Korea, and it became an official part of the Japanese Empire. So for the Japanese, Manchuria was there, for lack of better terminology to phrase this, it was their sort of Wild West, or it was their, what India was to the British. This was their imperial domain they were hoping to conquer and exploit. They wanted it for economic reasons. They wanted it had raw materials and industrial capacity that they were limited in the Japanese home islands. They wanted it to grow food to feed their population, which was hard pressed in the Japanese home islands. And they wanted it for settlement to unload some of their, their population, to alleviate overcrowding in the home islands by settling Manchuria with Japanese settlers. So it was their imperial domain. And as a result, when the Japanese began to establish medical facilities, including Mukden Medical College, which was founded, Mukden is one of the major cities in Manchuria, and the Japanese established Mukden Medical College in 1911, there was sort of an anything goes mentality in Manchuria. It wasn't governed by the same ethics, the same laws, the same cultural norms that governed medical research in Japan itself, and particularly in terms of obtaining cadavers for research. In Japan, it was in the Japanese home islands, you were extremely limited about, you had to get families' permission, you had to get all, you had to go through sort of cultural and legal hoops. In Manchuria, you could just go out and find a body frozen in the tundra, and you could do what you wanted with it, to put that in a very crude sense. So, sorry to put it in so crude a way, but that's just how it worked for Manchuria. So research cadavers at Mukden Medical College were easy to use, easy to obtain. They didn't have to go through these limits. Use of Chinese and Manchurian patients were used at Mukden Medical College. They were offered free medical care on condition that after they died, they would leave their body to the hospital. And of course, these patients were so poor they couldn't afford to pay for medical care. So even if they decided eventually they didn't want to do this, they were left with a situation where they had no choice but to kind of stay in this arrangement. So again, this is an arrangement that wouldn't have been tolerated in mainland Japan. So you had already a culture in the early 20th century in Manchuria among the Japanese medical establishment there that involved a lack of patient consent and of ethical safeguards. A little bit more historical context, a key turning point was 1931 when the Japanese army located in Manchuria actually arranged a pretext so they could conquer the whole of Manchuria as opposed to just having a sphere of influence there. So that's what they did. They conquered it in a few months. This greatly increased research opportunities, if you want to use that term, with essentially was a wartime environment eroding the already threadbare sort of ethical safeguards were eroded even further during this wartime environment, because you did have anti-Japanese rebels among the Chinese and Manchurian population. The Japanese called them bandits, and essentially if they captured any of these people, they executed them. So to be an anti-Japanese rebel essentially carried a death sentence if you were caught. So since the Japanese were already going to execute these people, they arranged with Mukden Medical College to hand over the cadavers of these people after they were executed. So again, another ethically challenged source, if you will, of medical cadavers from Mukden Medical College. And it got to the point where the Japanese army would actually schedule the executions to make it easier for the doctors from Mukden Medical College to claim the bodies in a timely fashion to best facilitate their research. And so these sort of, eventually this, by the mid-1930s, bred into outright vivisections performed by doctors at MMC and other places in Manchuria, just civilian Japanese doctors working on their own, but in cooperation with the Japanese army. Couple last key points. At the same time this environment was taking place, you had in 1933 the creation of a special biological warfare medical research unit called the Togo Unit, a forerunner of what would become in a few years Unit 731. And then in July 1937, Japan went to full-scale war with China, and to the point where eventually 1 million Japanese troops were in China, and they occupied a large part of the country up until August 1945. So Japan going to full-scale war in China meant that whatever remaining ethical safeguards, whatever they were pretty much off the board at this point. Anything went. And this all focused here on Manchuria, where you had a combination of Japanese imperial ambitions, unethical research practices, a culture going back a couple decades that was already only growing, becoming ever more unethical, and medicine for military purposes designed to facilitate the effectiveness of the armed forces. The belief that, hey, we know how to combat these viruses and bacteria in a defensive way. Maybe there's a way we could use them in an offensive way to facilitate our military efforts. So military medicine strictly as a means of military efficiency to facilitate military gains and military victory. All of these phenomena converged by the late 1930s. Imperial ambitions, a place where anything went ethically, and a desire to use military medicine as a tool of military victory, all converged to lay the groundwork for a very horrific campaign of medical atrocities, which I will turn it back over to Sheena now and to explore what that entailed. From a scholar, the expropriation of human bodies and the practice of colonial medicine in Manchuria thus set the historical precedent for Unit 731. These slides will be made available, by the way, so if you want to see any of these quotes or the sources, by all means, you'll be able to do so. Just the slides will be made available.
Thank you, David. So now I will talk about Unit 731 specifically. I know that you're all here today, but I'm just curious, who had heard of Unit 731 before attending this lecture? Okay, cool. So many of you, but not all of you. So Unit 731 is an interesting example that has really had the spotlight shone on it since the 90s, when we started to have revelations about what had happened in the Pacific Theater, and specifically with things like this. But what's interesting about Unit 731 is that it was both happening out in the open and had certain kind of clandestine features. So we call it Unit 731, but its formal name was that it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Unit. unit. It was part of that department of their army. So it existed under that Auschwitz. When people received orders to Unit 731, they received a tasking to the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Unit. That is what they thought they were going to do. It was directed by Shiro Ishii, who is a bacteriologist that was trained at Kyoto Imperial University. He is credited with starting this and making it happen. He was a very powerful person in Japan at this time and successfully advocated for the creation of this unit and the widespread research that it did. Now, I will tell you, I always find it slightly problematic to use the word research when I'm talking about these type of medical atrocities, because I do not think that this is research. I think that it is something else. It is useful to think of it as research to understand how it was normalized and legitimized at the time, because these were not kind of one-off torture sessions done by psychopaths. These were formal research protocols that were established and allowed to take place within the unit. But I just have to put that out there, because every time I say research or experiment, it breaks my heart a little bit. So this was a very widespread phenomenon, as David will talk about in a minute, but the massive complex that Shiro Ishii really started was in Pingfan in Manchuria. It was a large kind of palace-like setting. There were many buildings, there were labs, there were animal houses, there were prisons, there were autopsy halls, crematoria, and a full school. So people assigned to that unit were also taking classes about things like epidemic control, germ theory, sanitation, and hygiene, all while also participating in the experiments and research within Unit 731. This was a huge undertaking that did not involve just a few rogue agents. There were over 3,000 personnel at this site that included Army doctors or physicians, scientists, technicians, and students, some coming from the youth corps. And I always find involvement of medical students in things like this, in war atrocities, to be quite indicative of moves to normalize that behavior from very early on in a professional trajectory. So this Unit 731, like I said, it had a name that was not indicative of what was actually happening there. It was supported by many leading universities, and its ostensible purpose was put out as research on epidemic control and biological defense. So they're interested in controlling those epidemics and in defending against biological weapons. In fact, the real aim was more aligned with biological weapons development. So we'll talk about the experimentation here quickly. The human subjects that were used in these experiments were people including Chinese civilians, the anti-Japanese guerrillas, sometimes called bandits, prisoners, some allied POWs, all people that had been kind of pushed out of that sanctified universe of moral obligations. They were people that the Japanese saw as others or lesser than, and so they could be made useful through experimentation. One of the more troubling things, well, it's always weird to say that, there's many troubling things, but one of the ways that they talked about human subjects in a very dehumanizing way, which is important in understanding how this could happen, is that these participants, these human subjects, were referred to as marutas, or logs. Sometimes when they were cremated at the end, that was talked about as being, of course, what you do with logs. You burn them in fire at the end. And this is very telling, because as the people, the 3,000 staff working in this site, if you're constantly referring to the humans as something other than human, that is a strong psychological power in rendering that person the other and dehumanizing them. So they were maruta. The experiments that happened included just surgical practice, that is just people, physicians, they need to learn how to do surgery somehow, so why not practice on these prisoners or this clinical material? So people had surgery that they did not need. This included amputations and the removal of organs just for practice, no other purpose. There were also infection experiments, which were all about just how to best infect the human body with a pathogen, a germ, or a disease. And that included many different versions. I think that one of the actually most troubling things about Unit 731 is the widespread use of vivisection. And I am assuming everyone in the room knows what vivisection is, but vivisection is the live dissection of an animal or a human. So whereas dissection is what our medical students do in anatomy lab to learn about anatomy, vivisection involves actually cutting into a living being. And they felt that vivisection was important because it was the only way to actually see how the disease process was impacting the living human. Too much has changed once they have died, and so you don't have that real view into what is impacting the human body when it comes to epidemic disease. Very importantly, when it comes to vivisection, there was generally no anesthesia used. There are some anecdotal stories about putting something in the person's mouth, or perhaps hitting them or punching them till they're unconscious. So not all were conscious, but they were all alive and not provided anesthetic. And one of the things that David said that I think is really important is that all of these experiments were meant to promote military medicine and help increase the lethality of the Japanese force. So they're also interested in frostbite tests. This is something that the Nazis were also very interested in because their soldiers are fighting on cold fronts. And we did not yet know how to bring someone back from a hypothermic state or how to treat frostbite. So it is actually these frostbite tests that are sometimes said as being why we know how to treat frostbite now. They used to previously believe you could treat frostbite by like rubbing the affected limb really hard. That doesn't work. You want to submerge it in water of a particular temperature. That was developed. Apparently, that's one of the things that came out of these tests. An interesting corollary, since the Nazis and their hypothermia experiments are also the only example of real medical knowledge gained throughout the hundreds or thousands of experiments done in wartime Germany. Also, they did weapons tests. On each of these, I feel like I could give an entire slide, so I'm going through them quickly. But weapons tests involved just understanding how modern weaponry impacts the human body, both to maximize lethality against your enemy and also to be able to repair your own servicemen. So they did various things, which some of the more infamous examples include tying people to stakes at various distances from a bomb site and then exploding some sort of ordnance to see how far the shrapnel flies and to see how it impacts people at each distance. In these studies in particular, everyone was vivisected on the field or then killed and dissected later. And that is a really important part, and I think one of the things that I struggle most with conceptualizing this as a research is that the end point in all of these experiments is the death of the human subject, either through vivisection or so that they can be autopsied or dissected later. Unlike some of the Nazi experiments, Unit 731 has no survivors from its experiments. There was 100% fatality rate, either from the experimentation itself or the execution and dissection that would happen after. There were also some interesting studies, interesting in a perverse way, around blood and seawater, as well as starvation. And these show a very interesting turn towards just curiosity. Now that we have this clinical material, we can find out how the human body is impacted through various things. So they tried, much like the Nazis, to see how long someone could go without eating, just to starve them. Don't provide them food. food, provide them some water or some distilled water and others regular water to see how long the human body can survive like that. Others included looking at the use of seawater as a possible replacement for blood loss. Others, so they would remove blood and inject seawater into these human subjects. Others just tried to see how much blood you can take from a person before they die. And so would just remove blood every day as much as they could until that person died. I already talked about dehydration. And what's so interesting is that these people were talked about as Maruta. And I told you the Unit 731, the Ping Fan facility outside of Harbin, it was built with a lot of high walls so that the people in the surrounding world couldn't really see what was going on in there. But it was also happening out in the open. They were gathering clinical material and sharing it across the Japanese Empire. And they were also openly discussing and publishing this research. So some of this research was even broadly published in medical journals at the time, but instead of referring to their human subjects, they simply said that they were doing experiments on monkeys. What's really interesting is that now there is some discussion about how this was very much an open secret because the things like the core temperature of the monkey or the ape, some of the more kind of clinical notes just wouldn't apply to a monkey or an ape if you knew any better. You had to know it was a human, but they just weren't saying that. Beyond the fact that generally when you do experiments with monkeys, you have to say what monkey it was. You don't just say, oh, it was monkeys. And so it was very much happening out in the open and clandestinely, which I think really contributes to this normalization, which I'm fascinated in. So here is one quote, and this is from the testimony it has the wrong citation, I'll fix that. As soon as the symptoms were observed, the prisoner was taken from his cell and into the dissection room. He was stripped and placed on the table, screaming, trying to fight back. He was strapped down, still screaming frightfully. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth. Then with one quick slice of the scalpel, he was opened up. The researchers then conduct their examination of the organs, remove the ones that they want for study, then discard what is left of the body. So that is one piece of testimony. These things didn't just exist in the lab or in the facility. One of the things that is more unique about the Japanese experience, thinking in comparison to the Nazis, is their use of field trials. I'll open with a quote. The plane scattered wheat into the city center. People began to sweep it up to use to feed their chickens, not knowing that the wheat contained plague-infected fleas. Reverend Crouch, this is a quote obviously, did not realize what had happened until a few days later when the first bubonic plague symptoms appeared among people who lived in the center of the city. 20 people died within a few days of the pathogen delivery. So they were doing many things in Unit 731. They were trying to understand how these diseases impacted the human body. They were also trying to figure out how to grow these pathogens at a large scale to be able to use as a biological weapon, and then how to disseminate that biological weapon in nearby communities. And this means that there were documented biological attacks in in these three areas. Now that description is from Ningbo. There are all sorts of stories that I have read about the field trials, including providing plague-laced chocolates to children and other things that just show how significantly othered this population was, to be able to walk up to a child and give them a chocolate that has bubonic plague in it. I mean, you have to really not care about that child at all. And it is just fascinating and so troubling to think about how people that are studying health and wellness would engage in this. So during this time, this is when they really developed a lot of great great ways of disseminating biological weapons. One of the most success that they had was to fly over with plague-infested wheat that would fall from planes that the people would gather, which is what is being discussed in that. But they tried many other ways, including just bombs with plague fleas. This estimate that approximately 200,000 civilians died from biological warfare in China is the high end of the estimate. There is no concrete number on this because of the massive kind of destruction that happened after the end of the War of the Record Keeping. So I did want to flag that. That is very much the top end of the estimates. So this was not just happening in Unit 731 and then in the areas around Unit 731. There was a broader network under Shiro Ishii. This network of biomedical research and field units really spanned Japan's empire. And so I have Unit 731, Unit 100, 1855, 1644, which was in Nanking, and 8604. I won't spend too much time on that because David will be going into some of the beyond Unit 731 stuff. But what I want to end with when we're talking about Unit 731 are these two quotes. And there's a lot of discussion of Unit 731 in the broader military history discourse. It is not as well covered in medical ethics or military medical ethics, but it is covered, interestingly, in the military medical ethics textbook that was published back in 2003. And that's where I pulled these two quotes. And they highlight just the banality of this evil. So first, quote, "I did it," performed vivisections, "because I thought I was serving the emperor. At first, I felt very bad, but after a few operations, I got used to it. What is scary is that I don't get nightmares." The next quote, "The logs, or Maruta, the human subjects, were there for experimental purposes. There was no guilt associated with that process. I take pride in having taken part in this work. I have no regrets. It was war." And I think what David talked about at the beginning about the fact, or in his last slide deck, that it wasn't just that these people were others. It started off as being prisoners that were going to be executed anyway. It is an easier jump, perhaps psychologically, to do things or perform medical atrocities on someone that has done something wrong, been convicted of it, and is now going to die anyway. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Just do Unit 731, as Sheena was outlining, is by far the most single heinous and most well-known example of medical atrocities committed by the Japanese armed forces and Japanese medical establishment during what you can call the Greater Pacific War from 1931 to 45. Excuse me. However, horrific medical experiments, it's not the only example. Horrific medical experiments up to and including vivisections were performed throughout Japan's wartime empire between 1937 to 45. Traditionally, these tend to be either treated as sort of an appendix or afterthought to Unit 731, or they're treated as just sort of a subset of Japanese wartime atrocities and war crimes in general. But the phenomenon is so widespread enough that we feel that it's indicative of a broader phenomenon, that Unit 731, it wasn't just Unit 731, there was a broader culture of depraved medical behavior throughout the Japanese Army Medical Corps, the Navy Medical Corps, which is important, and the civilian medical establishment that transcended Unit 731. It wasn't just Unit 731. That was just sort of the tip of the iceberg, if you will, or maybe a big part of the iceberg, but there was more to it than just that. It was indicative of a broader culture of depraved indifference to medical ethics among Japanese military and civilian doctors. The reason I emphasize Naval Medical Corps is because the Japanese Navy did not have anything to do with Unit 731. If you're at all familiar with the history of the Pacific War, you're aware that even by the universal standards of inter-service rivalry, the Japanese Army and Japanese Navy did not at all play well together. So the fact that Japanese naval doctors were willing to commit these atrocities, often usually on their own, take the initiative in committing these types of atrocities, shows that this culture was far more pervasive than just Shiro. It wasn't just Shiro Ishii and his influence. This culture was very pervasive. And so these more widespread beyond Unit 731 atrocities tended to be committed for two main reasons. One, training of medical personnel. The Japanese Army Medical Corps in particular expanded enormously as the Japanese Army expanded enormously. So you had doctors, like people were just told, doctors straight out of medical school. People were told, you're going to be an Army doctor now, congratulations. I'll give you a little bit more on that. But yeah, so you had a lot of new doctors and medics who needed to be trained, and this was their idea of training them, you'll see in a minute. Well, you've already got a sense from Unit 731. And also sort of the same culture of medical curiosity run amok that Sheena was describing. That culture existed outside of Unit 731 as well, research on human subjects. And again, the term research is used advisedly. This is an entry from a Japanese diary which is captured on the island of Guadalcanal, which is one of the main sites of one of the main battles of the Pacific War. This entry is dated September 26, 1942. The two prisoners were dissected while still alive by Medical Officer Yamaji, and their livers were taken out. And for the first time, I saw the internal organs of a human being. It was very informative, unquote. And so these two prisoners in question, if you're familiar with the Battle of Guadalcanal, those almost certainly were American Marines that are being talked about as being dissected, vivisected. In this case, they were still alive. And so this is, a group of Japanese soldiers hard-pressed in the middle of a hard-fought battle in a remote Pacific island find time to vivisect two prisoners. And that shows you just how pervasive this culture, this mindset was. We don't know anything about Medical Officer Yamaji. There's no evidence he had anything to do with Unit 731 or knew very much about it, but nonetheless, he was willing to go down this road to train people in combat medical procedures and anatomy just because he could. Another instance, a former Japanese Navy medic named Akira, or medical officer named Akira Makino, came forward in 2006 to confess that he had performed surgical experiments on, quote, about 30 prisoners between December 1944 and February 1945 while serving as a Navy medic on the island of Mindanao, which is a large island in the southern Philippines. As part of his medical training, he said he'd been ordered to conduct amputations, abdominal dissections, and other experiments on condemned men, women, and children, including two men who'd been beaten unconscious for allegedly spying for the U.S. These are quotes from an article from The Guardian from late November 2006. The link to the article and the citations right there. Again, these slides will be made available to you. So, again, just as training, vivisection as training of medical personnel, just because we're going to get rid of these people anyway, we might as well use them for something. And then finally, the last example I'll mention of this phenomenon is a man named Ken Yuasa, who served as a Japanese Army doctor in China from 1942 to 1945. He was taken prisoner at the end of the war and held in China until 1956. When after he was released, he eventually began to talk about his experiences, and he eventually published a memoir and went on lecture tours in Japan in the 1980s and 90s, and these are some quotes taken from a book. Vivisection was used to practice for performing operations at the front lines. I operated on living Chinese for who I had no hatred whatsoever to gain surgical ability in order to win the war. So again, medical efficiency above all else, no ethical considerations involved. And Yuasa, by his own testimony, participated in 14 dissections of recently executed prisoners, as well as a number of actual vivisections of prisoners. In one vivisection, 4 Chinese prisoners were each shot twice in the belly, and then they were immediately used to demonstrate how to treat gunshot wounds. Yuasa testified that half the doctors he arrived in China with had literally never held a scalpel before. Again, so the medical corps was greatly expanded. You had a lot of utterly inexperienced and frankly unqualified personnel. So they were desperate to teach them how to treat combat injuries, and so they were willing to do this by this kind of depraved method of literally shooting someone and then here's how you treat that injury. Just a couple examples of this sort of research run amok that I'll mention. These are relatively well-known examples. Truk Lagoon in the Central Pacific in January, February 1944. A Japanese naval officer, Surgeon Captain Hiroshi Iwadami, murdered 8 American prisoners at the end of January, early February 1944. 4 of them he killed by infecting them with Streptococcus bacteria, and they quickly died soon after, developed a high fever and died. 4 others were used in a tourniquet experiment. 2 of them had tourniquets applied to their arms and legs for 2 hours. 2 others had tourniquets applied to their arms and legs for 7 hours. The ones who had their tourniquets for 7 hours died soon after the tourniquets were removed. The ones who had tourniquets applied for 2 hours survived. So those last 2 surviving prisoners were taken a couple days later, tied to the ground, and had explosives detonated near them, which blew off their feet, but they still survived. So Iwanami was trying to get rid of them, so he had one of his subordinates then strangle both of them with his bare hands. After finishing that, the 2 survivors after they were strangled, these 2 tourniquet survivors then were taken and dissected and their organs removed. Some of the organs were also removed from the Streptococcus victims, but their bodies were then dumped over a cliff. Iwanami was captured after the war. They found out what he did. He was tried in 1947 on the island of Guam for his war crimes and hanged in 1949. A second extremely infamous example of Japanese medical research run amok outside of Unit 731 is the infamous Kyushu vivisections. This is a picture of an American B-29 bomber crew who were shot down over the island of Kyushu in May 1945. There were 12 men on the plane, 9 of them survived. The captain of the pilot of the plane was taken into the custody of the military police, the Kempeitai. Normally, the Kempeitai were not the one you wanted, so to speak, but in this case, ironically, he proved to be the lucky one of these 9 men, because the other 8 were eventually, over the course of May and June 1945, in 4 separate occasions, they were taken to the first surgical clinic of Kyushu Imperial University, where they were subjected to vivisections and then killed afterwards. In the first case vivisection, 2 of the men each had a lung removed. The next vivisection, 2 more men, they had stomach, heart, and liver removed from each of them. The last, one of them had a brain operation, which was designed to trace the origins of a particular nerve in the brain. I don't remember which one it was, but it wound up it failed, and he suffered irreversible brain damage, which they killed him. Of course, they're going to do that anyway. And then the last 3 individuals had stomachs, gallbladders, livers, and hearts operated on. If there was a theme, and of course the prisoners were all killed, as I said, the last procedure, they didn't even bother sterilizing at all. It was because it's like, we're killing them anyway, so why bother? If there was a theme to these operations, getting back to the sort of medical curiosity run amok, and this was something that Sheena mentioned, Unit 731 looked into as well. The use of seawater as a substitute for blood plasma, as a short-term substitute that you could use to stabilize blood pressure for a period of time. And it didn't seem to have worked in this case, but not that it was really going to work in this case anyway. The operations were performed. It was the first surgical clinic of Kyushu University that took the initiative. They asked the Army for these prisoners. They asked the Japanese Western Army to give them some American prisoners, and so they gave them these 8 individuals. And so they took the initiative. The Army cooperated. The head of the first clinic at Kyushu University, Imperial University, Dr. Fuji, let me look up his name here, sorry. Dr. Fukujiro Ishiyama was the instigator of this, and he he committed suicide. Eventually, U.S. war crimes investigators found out about this incident. Ishiyama committed suicide in prison. 3 of his doctors and 2 Army officers were tried and convicted to death for this. However, the behavior of the trial judge was deemed to have been unethical, so they received lighter sentences, and all the individuals involved were released by 1958. One thing to note is that these procedures, there were a handful of surgeons and a nurse involved in addition to Ishiyama, but there were also medical students and Army officers and others who basically formed an audience while these procedures were going on. And this is actually very famous, and it's well known even in Japan. Now, if you can, I can talk about that during the Q&A period if you're curious. So, again, Japanese civilian doctors, for their own purposes, working with the Army, but for their own ambitions, taking the initiative and conducting a horrible series of vivisections on American POWs in this case. There were numerous small-scale medical experiments that were not surgical or invasive in any way. Again, just medical curiosity run amok. I'm not going to just quickly mention a couple examples. There was January 1945 in Surabaya, the island of Java in present-day Indonesia. Japanese naval doctors, again, naval, conducted a tetanus vaccine test on 17 condemned Indonesian prisoners. 15 of the 17 men died. They gave them a tetanus vaccine they'd come up with, and they injected them with concentrated tetanus. The vaccine didn't work, obviously, because 15 of the 17 died of tetanus. In July 1945, a doctor at the Japanese military doctor on the island, on Rabaul, on the island of New Britain in the South Pacific, conducted malaria experiments on 5 American POWs, injecting them with blood from Japanese soldiers who had malaria, and 2 of those 5 died as a result. So there are a lot of other crimes and war crimes committed by Japanese medical personnel. We're not going to have time to get into them, but you can ask about them in the Q&A if you like. So at this point, I will turn it over back to Sheena and the post-war consequences and cover-up.
You. And I realize that we have a lot to say, so we're running a little bit low on time. I will cover these quickly but thoroughly. So why had not all of you heard of Unit 731 when most people have heard about the medical atrocities committed by people like Joseph Mengele and the Nazis in Auschwitz and Dachau? It is partially on purpose. The people that were involved in the medical atrocities in Japan, and specifically Shiro Ishii, advocated to get themselves an immunity agreement after the end of the war. So in Europe, as you'll recall, the war was won and it involved us and our allies. In Japan, it was just the United States. We were there alone, and we had a lot more control over what we could do there. These physicians who, I think a very great point that David brought up, I meant to highlight later, is that they wanted to do these experiments. They were not ordered to do the experiments. The physicians that designed them wanted to fulfill their curiosity, wanted to study these things. They then saw with the Americans coming to Japan an opportunity to leverage their information for immunity. So they began a very specific campaign to convince the Americans that Unit 731 specifically in Japan had done significant biological warfare research, and that data would be very useful to the United States as we moved into the Cold War period. At this time, there was an international convention that actually outlawed offensive biological and chemical warfare developments. You could only develop defensive capabilities like vaccines or antidotes. You couldn't develop weapons. So the Americans quickly realized that this is data that we could never get. We could never do these experiments at home, and so we need to know what they know. Because of this, Shiro Ishii and his colleagues were granted full immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research records. There was a Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, but it excluded biological warfare and human experimentation charges because of that immunity deal that had happened with negotiations from General Douglas MacArthur's staff, and specifically a Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who was a U.S. Army epidemiologist. So this data was taken in exchange for immunity and sent to Fort Detrick, Maryland, then Camp Detrick, which is where the biowarfare research is done for the United States military and was at the time. So even though these atrocities were known to some extent, no major Japanese medical personnel were tried for these crimes. This is very different than what happened in Nazi Germany. For those of you who are familiar with the Nuremberg trial, which had a specific doctor's trial for physicians that had been engaged in medical atrocities, which led to death sentences and hanging. This did not happen here. In fact, in Japan, many of the people that had been involved went on to have high-powered careers. They resumed their academic and medical careers, and they took on positions of importance, some even becoming deans and other high-ranking people in academic medicine at the time. This meant that this history was untold. An important point also of the post-war silence is that unlike the liberation that happened in Europe, there was kind of a gap between the signing of the Potsdam Agreement and when Americans actually showed up in Japan. So they were able to destroy any remaining human subjects, any remaining prisoners, destroy their documentation, and bomb their facilities. Because of this, the only thing Americans could get are what they had and were given to us, unless knowledge exists. Since these people also went on to continue to be in positions of power, it led to a post-war silence where this was not even covered in the history books of Japan. In fact, public acknowledgement of these atrocities was delayed didn't happen at all until the 80s and 90s, when we started to see people come out and share testimonies from their own participation in the medical atrocities. People who had worked for Unit 731 and others coming forth and sharing those stories. And one thing I forgot to mention is that there was an order to take this to the grave that was given to everyone. They were supposed to be silent and not speak about what had happened. And so it's not until the 90s that we start to see, until we see anything come up. Then we have survivor testimony. We start to see an increase in investigative journalism and historians, including Sheldon Harris, who wrote one of the first books with The Factories of Death. So there was, though, a trial, which I will hand off quickly to David to discuss.
There was one effort to hold members of Unit 731 accountable for, and related organizations accountable for, the Japanese biological warfare research and practice research program in Manchuria, built around Shiro Ishii and his initiative. It was a trial by the Soviets in this Soviet far eastern city of Khabarovsk. It occurred in 6 days at the end of December 1949, excuse me. 12 Japanese, well, they weren't all officers, One of them was actually a private. They assembled 12 Japanese prisoners they'd taken at the end of the war in Manchuria, the Soviets had, and they put them on trial for the activities of Unit 731. 9 of them were involved with Unit 731. The other 3 were involved with Unit 100, which was tied to Unit 731, also in Manchuria. The Soviets, since early 1946, had begun investigating Unit 731 in the hopes that they could get it included in the docket of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They collected evidence from an estimated 1,000 Japanese prisoners they'd taken related to Unit 731 and its various activities. They built this extensive collection of information about the organization, about this initiative. They tried to get the U.S. to agree to include it in the Tokyo trials, but the U.S., as Sheena said, decided to cover up the existence of Unit 731. So the Soviets finally went ahead at the end of 1949, conducted a 6-day show trial designed to embarrass the U.S. and Japan while also revealing information about Unit 731. And the information revealed is rarely, very uncommon for the standards of Stalin-era show trials, reasonably accurate. This actually is a credible source on Unit 731. The information from the trial, the transcript, was actually published in English by the Soviets a year later, 1950. We have a copy over at Joyner Library, and I believe there's a copy here as well. There might be here at Lopus. So if anyone's curious about that. So, all 12 defendants were convicted, of course. They were sentenced from 2 years to 25 years worth of forced labor. So, all right, these people are finally someone's going to be punished for what Unit 731 did. Well, it was a little more complicated than that, because none of these defendants, 12 defendants, were sent to cut timber in Siberia or mine gold inside the Arctic Circle for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Instead, they were sent to a special prison in a city called Cherny, which is about 150 miles northeast of Moscow, where their forced labor consisted of aiding the Soviet biological weapons program. All 12 were released in 1956 and allowed to return to Japan. 11 of them did. The one who was an exception actually committed suicide because he was a traditionalist who believed he should be ashamed of himself for having been taken prisoner and cooperated with the enemy, so he committed suicide just as he was about to be sent back to Japan. So, moving on to the conclusion.
Thank you for sticking around a little late. We're going to wrap with some discussion. So as I told you, one of the reasons I was really interested in this project and started working with David was to try to understand how healers, how people who are in a caring profession in medicine could end up engaging in medical atrocities like this. A similar question that always plagued me as I read about Nazi doctors. And so here are some kind of preliminary discussion points that we're narrowing in on. Of course, the medical atrocities of Unit 731 were not anomalies, and I think that that is the most important part. This is not a unique evil done under Shiro Ishii. It is not unique to 731. This was much more widespread. This really proliferated a lot of aspects of military and civilian medicine in Japan at the time. This was made possible because of a desensitization to suffering that was part of that long normalization that we tried to track. And I think it is very critical to note that the language of science and medicine is really useful in sanitizing violence, to talk about killing as disinfection, as vivisection, as research, experimentation, prevention, or purification. It takes the killing out of it. It makes it more palatable. It makes it more normalized. It makes it easier for us to understand how people might engage in these horrors. I already mentioned Maruta, or the idea of stripping the human beings that are experiencing the suffering of their names and identity, and thereby stripping them of that moral worth that puts them within this universe of obligation that we have to other humans. It's also very telling to note that in the history of medicine in Japan at this time, caregiving and medicine were not grounded in the things that we think of today when we think of doctors and physicians in the West or even there. Instead, physicians and medicines and medicine in general was much more grounded in protection of the state's biological health. It was aggregate and population-based to the extreme. I believe that the term was a kokutai, yes, for the biological health of the nation, the nation's body. And then last, I first started studying the banality of evil, which is an idea offered by Hannah Arendt in her study of Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I find it to be very interesting whenever we're talking about medical atrocities, because it is easy for us to think Shiro Ishii, Mengele, those are evil psychopaths, right? They're the kind of people that do these things. But what me and David have tried to show is that it was so much more pervasive. It was not just one bad apple. Terrible acts can be committed not by fanatics or sociopaths, but by ordinary individuals who unthinkingly conform to authority, following rules, and accept prevailing norms without moral reflection. This was based on this idea of Hannah Arendt seeing a Nazi on trial and being most shocked by how ordinary he was. And that ordinariness taught her and is a useful insight for us in ethics about how deep malevolence might not be all that it is. At some point, it is just thoughtlessness. It is a failure to stop, question, engage, and think critically about what you're actually doing. And so that is how we are thinking this became possible. Of course, we'll never fully know, but that is our work in progress. And thank you very much. We'll take any questions that you have.
For our live audience, we had some technical issues earlier, but the recording will be available later that has that gap. If you have questions, please speak into the mic for our online audience to be able to hear.
I was just curious if the United States had any kind of equivalent. I know that we have our own history of eugenics and forced sterilization, but I mean specifically like during the war, did we do any experimentation on prisoners that you know of?
Well, the United States does have a history of doing research on prisoners in general, not just within war times. It's one of the reasons that they're a protected class now in research, because in general, research has always been really interested in captive populations. They're people that not only can't say no, but from an experimental standpoint are the most valuable because they all live in the same place, they eat the same thing, the factors are controlled. My understanding is that a lot of medical experimentation that happened during World War II happened, I'm afraid I'm going to misspeak, so I'm actually going to hand it off to David if you have anything to say. But
Sure, that's right.
Oh, great.
I would, there was no American equivalent of Unit 731. That would just kind of be, America did develop a biological weapons program during World War II that became eventually, during the 1950s and 1950s, quite extensive, but it wasn't based on any kind of human testing like this, or at least nothing that came remotely close to Unit 731. I know there were other issues like medical, ethical issues like the Tuskegee experiment, for example, but nothing that involved biological warfare specifically. I know CIA did, they had this insane chemist who worked for CIA who tested LSD on unwitting people, but that was like short, like small scale, like one person at a time. But yeah, nothing, I would say nothing like this. I mean, the US committed plenty of atrocity of its own during the Pacific War, but no, what you would call medical atrocities, no equivalent of this.
Right, that's one of the reasons they wanted that information so bad. They wanted the information because they knew they couldn't do those kind of experiments in the United States.
Any questions, Larry?
Thank you. I had a question because you were talking about how this unit had a lot of medical trainees involved, and it was kind of a medical education practice. Do we see any trickle-down effects into medical education moving forward in Japan with the lack of public recognition of this as an evil that the country had perpetuated? Are there trickle-down effects that continue through history in terms of the educational practice?
So yes, I became very interested in the involvement of Youth Corps in Unit 731, partially because of my research into Nazi doctors and how they had a sister organization in medical schools that was actually required that all medical students become a part of it. But I think the better answer to your question is that in the post-war Japan, there was no reckoning with what had happened because it wasn't openly discussed. And it wasn't discussed until the 80s or 90s. And I think one of the ways that we can see that is that, well, in Germany, we have the creation of the Nuremberg Code, you know, directly out of the medical atrocities. After the war ended in Japan, there was no rush to have a code of medical ethics. There was no rush for any kind of reform in the medical education system. They still widely celebrated eugenics, I believe continued with sterilization, continuing past then. But one thing that I think is telling is that we don't see the first formal code of medical ethics in Japan until the early 1950s. But that code doesn't get at a lot of the things that we would expect from a code. It is in fact mostly based on how doctors are paid and not paid, and has less to do with what we would consider kind of patient-centered ideals. So I think that that's one way that it continued to impact Japanese society, is just there was no reckoning. There was this, you could continue to not focus on the individual.
One thing I can just add to that, speaking specifically about the Kyushu incident, the Kyushu B-29 crewman vivisections, is that, as I mentioned, that's relatively well known, including in Japan, and there are a couple of individuals Japanese individuals who witnessed it as young doctors or medical students who've taken the lead in that. One is a man named Shusaku Endo, who actually became a novelist, and in 1958 he wrote a novel called The Sea and Poison, which is actually a novelization of one of the Kyushu vivisections. And it became it's well-known, very well-known novel. It became talking about the people involved and their motive, I mean the fictional characters, but trying to discuss why they did this. It was made into an actual film in 1986. You can see the trailer on YouTube, a Japanese film. You can just tell from the trailer, there's nothing graphic in it, but you can just tell this is a really disturbing movie. Also, Dr. Toshio Tono, who was a medical student during the vivisections at Kyushu, he came forward in 1980 with his story, and he testified for years until he died at age 95 a few years ago. He took the lead in kind of talking about this and what he witnessed, and Kyushu University set up a permanent exhibit at their medical history facility about the vivisections about 10 years ago, and Dr. Tono donated his papers to Kyushu University in support of their commemoration of it, if that helps.
Any other questions? We have any online, Molly? Well, thanks everybody for attending. Thanks to Professor Eagan and Durant for coming and speaking for us today, and get some snacks, and thank you.
Thank you all.